High energy. Here are things I read. I just finished reading The Unconsoled by Kazuo Ishiguro. I'm going to do a full video on this. It'll be the next dedicated one-book video that I do. I finally read The Unconsoled. This means I have now read all of my favourite author's novels, ever. It took me a long time to get to The Unconsoled, purely on the basis that it is his longest book. It is 530 pages, and I couldn't be bothered. I read so much, and the shorter the book, the better. I also really stand by the idea that if a book can't have its narrative succinctly told in under 400 pages, is it worth being told? Well, you'll find out in my video when I cover this, but The Unconsoled is a very divisive Kazuo Ishiguro novel, and it is really, really good in my opinion. I adore it. But I really, really want to do a big dedicated video on it, so I'm going to save that until that. I read 2 Becky Chambers books this month. What's this one called? To Be Taught If Fortunate. And The Monk... no. A Psalm for the Wild Built, a monk and robot book. These are 2 very short little novella-ish books by Becky Chambers, and they're both very, very different kinds of sci-fi. They inspired me to do a video titled The Genius of Becky Chambers, where I explored the different ways in which she tackles science fiction and the different types or subgenres of science fiction. To Be Taught If Fortunate feels almost like hard sci-fi. It is an exploration of what humanity can do, what it should do, morals and ethics and philosophy and the boundaries of science. And this is a philosophical exploration of the meaning of life, as told by a monk and robot having a conversation with each other out in a forest on a made-up moon. They are both stunning pieces of science fiction, but they are very different kinds of sci-fi. One is barely sci-fi at all, other than the fact that it has a robot in it and it's set on a moon. Other than that, it feels like a philosophical metaphor. And then this, as I said, is borderline hard sci-fi that explores the boundaries of science. Becky Chambers is amazing. She has become one of my absolute all-time favourite authors, and these 2 books are magnificent. I loved both of them so much. I really think that wherever I go in the future, wherever I move to, I'm often offloading books. I have to say goodbye to so many books. I sell them, I gift them to people, I put them in charity shops, whatever. I'm always getting rid of books because I move around a lot and I'm never in one place for that long, but I think that these are 2 books that I'm going to keep with me. They're both tiny, they're both pretty, I can keep them in my luggage very easily, I'm going to keep a hold of them and keep them very close to my chest. I don't know where it is, but I also read Brickmakers by Selva Almada, translated by Annie McDermott. I loved this book. Selva Almada is my favourite Argentinian author, bar none, and Annie McDermott is a fantastic translator of Spanish to English. Brickmakers is one of my favourite translated books of this year. It's a real masterpiece. It is dark, it is horrible. It tells the story of 2 young men who, at the beginning of the novel, have stabbed each other in a knife fight and are both dying on the floor of a closed amusement park. These 2 young boys grew up as neighbours and their fathers hated each other. Their fathers were both brickmakers out in a small rural town in Argentina, and the 2 men, one ended up dying, the other ended up leaving. Until that point, they both hated each other and they were both horrible people. This is about inherited aggression, inherited masculinity. Selva Almada, through her novels, is often making a point about the toxicity of hypermasculinity and the dangers of it, and this particular novel is about how we inherit those issues from father to son, how masculinity breeds hate and anger and aggression. It's such a good novel. It is brutal and it is nasty and it is aggressive and it is full of very unpleasant things, but it has very poignant points to make. Brickmakers is wonderful. Another book that I read and reviewed and adored this month is The Easy Life in Kamusari. This is by a pretty well-known Japanese author, Shion Miura, and translated by the also well-known and beloved Japanese to English translator, Juliet Winters Carpenter. I love the work that Carpenter does. She is always great, and she's great here at translating this lovely, kind of slice of life, coming of age, very relaxing novel. I've already done a dedicated review, which you can go watch, but suffice to say, The Easy Life in Kamusari is about a young late-teen boy who was born and raised in Yokohama, which is the second largest city in Japan, so he's used to a very city life. And his family, after high school, throw him out into the woods, not like to be eaten by wolves, but to become a forestry person, what are they called? Tree surgeon? I don't think they ever use that term, but I'm sure that's what we call it. Forestry. It's a forestry training program. And he goes out into this village that is very, very different from anything that he's used to. It has its own festivals and traditions and language and turns of phrase and all sorts. And he finds love in this place. He finds camaraderie and family, and he didn't expect any of that. He went in feeling very negative and begrudging his family for sending him out to do that because he didn't know what else to do with his life. And that's what you get. You don't know what to do with your life? Well, we're going to throw you into a village and you're going to learn how to cut trees. And he ends up really loving it. He gets the easy life in Kamusari, but it's also not an easy life. So it's a chill and relaxing and wholesome life, but it's also far from easy. So I guess there's a double meaning to that title. It's a really charming book. It has a kind of a Moby Dick vibe where you get a lot of details about forestry and how it works and the kind of facts and details of it as the narrative goes, but they're not dry and boring. They genuinely help to reinforce the world building of this area, this place. You really feel it, and it's very charming and very sweet, and even though I grew up in the countryside, this really still feels like an entirely other world to me. I really loved it. Another Japanese novel that I read and enjoyed was How Do You Live by Genzaburo Yoshino. This is Hayao Miyazaki's favourite novel from when he was a kid, and it is being adapted into his next and supposedly final Studio Ghibli animated movie. And so I wanted to read it before the film comes out. I wanted to find out what is so inspiring about this novel, especially for young boys. Genzaburo Yoshino wrote this book in the 1930s, it is set in the 1930s, and it's set in a Tokyo that doesn't really exist anymore, a pre-war Tokyo. And it's really lovely. It's a story about a young boy who lost his father, and his mother and his uncle are kind of raising him to be a good young man. And it's a series of chapters where he encounters difficult situations, or he creates difficult situations by accident and has to fix them. It's about a young boy stumbling through his teen years and doing the best that he can, trying to build his own moral compass, trying to do right by other people, trying to find happiness and satisfaction in life. It's got a lot of messages about how to best live for other people as well as for yourself. It really is a lovely book for teenage boys to read. It's focused on helping people and being kind and how that kindness benefits society. And all the while, the uncle is telling the boy stories and reinforcing that message in sometimes a kind of patronizing way, in kind of a mansplainy way, but mostly in a very useful way. I did a dedicated video on this that you can go watch. Please do. I really enjoyed making that video in particular. I also read a whole bunch of manga, but I think I'm going to do a few dedicated videos, and I can't even remember what I read off the top of my head. I read loads of volumes of Berserk. I just keep reading Berserk, because once you start reading Berserk, that's what happens. I actually started reading Berserk years ago, read a bunch of volumes, and then stopped, and now I've just basically gone back to the start, read all those volumes, and beyond that point as well. So I am knee-deep in Berserk now. Even though I've technically been a fan for a long time, I'm really in it now. I also read the first 2 volumes of Jujutsu Kaisen. I love the anime. It's one of my favorite anime of all time, honestly, even though it's very, very new. There is so much to love about Jujutsu Kaisen, and so I wanted to read the first 2 volumes. And I did. Well, actually, I read Volume 0 and then Volume 1, and Volume 0 is not adapted into the anime yet, but it's going to be adapted into a film that's a prequel to the show. And Volume 0 is really good, and Volume 1 is exactly the same as it is in the anime, but so beautifully drawn. Anyway, I'll do a video on that probably. And here's a novel I read, Ariadne by Jennifer Saint. I did a video on this as well. There is a huge wave of feminist retellings of Greek stories at the moment. There has been for many years now, starting with the Song of Achilles. And Ariadne is probably my favourite of all of them. Song of Achilles, Thousand Ships, Circe, The Silence of the Girls, Ariadne. I love Ariadne. I really, really do. It is a little more playful than the others somehow, even though its subject matter and its characters and its events are all just as tragic and difficult and harsh as all of the others, as all of the Greek myths are. They're all about cruelty and people screwing each other over, etc. And this one is no different. But yet there's something playful about it, there's something wholesome. It could just be the fact that the one god that is predominantly in this story is Dionysus. And Dionysus is typically known for being a very hedonistic god. And he's a lot more complex than that here. Definitely starts off that way, but there's a lot more to him than that. This book tells the story of Ariadne, daughter of King Minos. The labyrinth is built by, what's his name? Daedalus? The labyrinth is built, the Minotaur is trapped, Theseus comes along, jumps into the labyrinth, kills the Minotaur, and that's when the story really begins, all from Ariadne's perspective. And shortly after that, she ends up on an island, and she meets Dionysus. And I like Dionysus. He's cute. Lastly, I think, is She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. This is another really fantastic retelling, kind of a legend, of Chinese history from around the 13th century. 14th century? 1300s, 14th century. This is something that toes the line between historical fiction, legend and mythology, and fantasy. It has a real fantasy tone to it. And She Who Became the Sun is also, most importantly, a queer retelling. It is something that explores the, I guess philosophy is a word you could use, the philosophy of gender queerness, of being non-binary and trans. But it is placing all of that in a 14th century Chinese setting, so therefore all of this terminology is null and void. And it's about the boundaries between gender, and in my video I was careful to avoid using the Mulan comparison, but I think here, for the sake of speed and simplicity, it's a kind of Mulan story. It is the tale of a young girl whose brother dies. She disguises herself as him in order to get into a monastery where she can survive and not starve to death, and from there she joins a rebel army and rises through the ranks of that rebel army to fight back against the Mongols who are currently occupying China. And the lines between her being a girl and a boy start to blur as she has this secret, this disguise, and yet she begins to feel as though she is both and neither. And as a non-binary person, I found that truly enrapturing. And also, it's truly enrapturing as a Chinese epic as well. This is a fantastic book. If you're a fantasy fan or a historical fiction fan or a fan of Chinese fiction, any of these things, you're really going to get a kick out of She Who Became the Sun, which is also just a brilliant name. I think that's all the books that I read in November. I've probably missed out some manga that I tore through. I just started reading Dr. Stone. I didn't like the anime. I found it too silly, and so far, all of that silliness is intact in the manga, and yet I'm enjoying it more. Sometimes that just happens. There might be other stuff I forgot too. Go through my recent videos and you might find videos dedicated to things I forgot to mention here. I don't know, I make a lot of videos. Happy December! Subscribe for books, forgot to say that.